So in this tutorial, I want to talk about the general conversation. Now, the general conversation is the longest part of the speaking exam, and it's also the part that carries the highest amount of marks. So it's really important to get it prepared as well as you can. So the essentials. For the foundation tier, it lasts between 3 and 5 minutes in total, and the higher tier, it lasts between 5 and 7 minutes in total. Anything that goes out over 5 minutes at foundation or 7 minutes at higher does not get marked. There's two themes that are examined, and these are the two themes that are not covered in your photo card. For instance, if you are examined on the school and future plans in your photo card, this will not come up in your general conversation. For foundation tier, you must spend a minimum of 1.5 minutes on each theme, and at higher tier, you must spend a minimum of 2.5 minutes on each theme. You're not allowed your notes at this point, so you'll have no access to anything with any Spanish, French, German on it. And you must ask a question, and that question's got to be related to the two themes that appear in the general conversation. So if your photo card's on school and future plans and you say, what do you like studying? That question would not count. And the question's got to make the examiner say something in response. And you must use the past, the present, and the future timeframes. Now I'm talking about timeframes here. So for instance, if we consider the past, in Spanish we can say comí, I ate, we can say comía, I used to eat, we could say he comido, I have eaten, I could go for había comido, I had eaten. So there's various different ways, and each one of these is a separate tense. Now AQA don't specify which tense you have to use, you just have to refer to the past, and it has to make sense in the context. So whichever way you do it, it doesn't matter as long as it makes sense. And it's the same with the future. You could say I want, I would like, I will, I'm going, and it just, as long as it makes sense in the context, you get the credit for it. I think it's really important that you understand as students that, I know you are often really stressed out by this part of the exam because it's the unknown bit, it's the bit that you can't prepare for. However, your teachers are just as stressed out about this part of the exam as you, because we can cost you marks if we don't get our exam conduct correct. So, for teachers, a few things to bear in mind. The first thing, the timing for your first theme starts when you ask the first question. So for instance, when you're saying, and now I take your notes and your cards from you, now we're going to start with the general conversation, we're going to start with the theme of school and future plans. That bit of blurb that you say at that point doesn't count. The timer starts when you ask the first question. For instance, what do you study at school? And it's the same with the second theme. You start the second theme timing when you ask the first question of the second theme. So if you're saying, for instance, and now we're going to move on to the second theme. The second theme is local, national, and international areas of interest, theme number, whatever it is. That little bit of blurb doesn't count. It actually counts as the time for theme 1. It's only when you say, how do you protect the environment? That's when the timer starts for the second theme. Now, where this is important, especially a foundation tier, I've seen this happen more often, is that a teacher might let a student talk about their chosen theme for longer. So for instance, a foundation tier exam lasts for 5 minutes. A teacher might let the student talk for their chosen theme for 3.5 minutes. And by the time they've done the introductory blurb for the second theme and asked the first question, they've eaten into the 1.5 minutes minimum that a student must speak for on both themes. Because remember, after 5 minutes, that doesn't get marked, and the same at higher after 7 minutes. So it costs the students marks, it incurs a penalty. So it's really important that the timings are really on point. My suggestion for timings more than anything else is foundation, aim for 2 minutes per theme, and higher, aim for 3 minutes per theme. The reason why I'm saying that is because you get 4 minutes overall, so that 4 minutes allows you 1 minute for anything for a bit of wiggle room. And the same with higher, that gives you 6 minutes in total, which gives you 1 minute wiggle room as well. It's for you to ask a question or for a student ask you a question, just in case anything goes wrong. In terms of penalties, if a candidate dips under the minimum amount of time, so for instance, if they only give you 1 minute 29 for a foundation theme, or for higher they only give you 2 minutes 29 rather than the 2.5 minutes, that's the minimum, then the student would receive 2 marks taken off their communication marks. So it would only come off communication, but if they were awarded 8 marks of communication, that would get lowered to 6. If a student doesn't ask a question or the question is not relevant, again, they receive a 1 mark penalty from communication only. So students can incur a 3-mark penalty in total. The last point's really important as well. If a student only covers one theme, then their communication mark is capped at 5. Now, this is important because, for instance, if a student does a photo card in school and future plans, and they're talking about local, national, and international areas of interest as their chosen theme, and then as their second theme in the general conversation they talk about school and future plans, that would be counted as one theme being covered, and the student would have their mark capped at 5. My big piece of advice more than anything else is when you're preparing for your exams, get a colleague to double check, to cross check your order with you to make sure that it works. So, in order to know how to get the best marks, we need to know how the general conversation is marked. It's marked using a range of symbols that you can see on the left-hand side. So, for instance, a tick is a clear piece of information with a verb. You get a dash if you give a clear piece of information without a verb. A plus, you get an enhancement, so it might be a more complex structure or unusual vocabulary. If we look a bit further down, we've got our opinions and justifications. So the fact that that's looked at suggests to me that you must use them throughout your exam. We've got our questions as well, so you've got to give a question. And where things start to go wrong, we've got our A's. So the A without a circle around it is a minor inaccuracy, so it might be gender, it might be adjectival agreement. It doesn't affect the communication. But if you get a verb wrong and it completely stilts the communication, that would be an A with a circle. That's a more serious mistake. To see how this marking code works, I'm going to write an example for you. But what I would suggest you do is, if you're reviewing your speaking mocks at any point, go through, listen to your answers and mark them with these symbols. Vale, so there's my answer now. So if I go through this and annotate this as an examiner, this is what an examiner would do. Normalmente, mi familia y yo vamos de vacaciones. I'm going to give a tick because I've got a piece of information and a verb. A Alicante, that's an extra bit of information, dado que siempre hace sol. I've given another bit of information there. Creo que es muy importante que pasemos, so I've started with my opinion. Creo que es muy importante que pasemos las vacaciones juntos. So I've given my opinion, but I've also, if we dig in that sentence, es importante que pasemos. We've got the present subjunctive there. That's complex. I'm going to give it a plus. Porque es imprescindible hablar con tus padres. Again, that's my justification. I'm saying why. I've got my es, it's a justification with a verb. Es imprescindible, that's a nice little adjective there, really, really important. Hablar con tus padres y pasar tiempo con ellos. And again, I'm going to give it another tick for that because we've got a verb in that second bit there. So if I look at this answer there, what I can draw, the conclusion I can draw is that it's got an opinion, it's got justifications, and it's clearly developed. So this is the kind of annotation that you will get. And what I would really advise you do is when you get mocks back, is that you go through, listen to your answers and try and practice that. What is the general picture? Are you developing lots or are you giving short answers? And this is important when we look at the mark scheme, which is coming up next. So we'll start with the foundation mark scheme, and the first thing to bear in mind is that the top two for each bracket are the same as higher. So these are the same as the bottom two, the level 1 and level 2 at higher. Okay, so it's overlap. So we'll start with communication. A speaker who usually gives quite short responses but occasionally gives extended responses. So sometimes you might go above and beyond. You might give an extra sentence or two. Occasionally narrates events. So again, that's going into more detail about one specific thing. So for instance, yesterday I went to the park with my friends. We played football and it was fantastic. That would be an example of narration. Going above and beyond and describing the one event. Usually gives clear information. So most of the time we understand what you're saying. But now and again there might be a little bit of confusion where there's a little bit of lack of clarity. And the most important bit, gives opinions, and some of which are explained, so you say why. Now, if we go down the band beneath, it's like a little scale, right? So where we were given opinions and justifying them in the above bracket, this one we only give opinions. There's no mention of justification. So if you didn't justify, you would be limited probably to this bracket. Few occasions where they're unable to answer, so you've got to be able to answer the questions. And occasional attempts at longer responses rather than occasionally giving extended responses. So as an attempt, it might not be successful. And that works as a skill. Now, as an examiner, I know I'm going down there, you mark from the bottom up. So you consider, is it in that band? No, but consider them for the one above. So that's how it works. In terms of range and accuracy, we're looking at a good language, mainly simple linguistic structures, some repetition, not loads though. Attempts to use more complex linguistic structures and more varied vocabulary. Attempts mean you try. It doesn't always have to be successful though. And more importantly, it makes reference to past and future events. Okay, so you've got to talk about the past, you've got to talk about the future. And you're allowed to have some errors, but what they don't do is they don't impede comprehension. Now, if we look at the bracket below, again, it's like a little skill. So this time, future events may only have limited success. So your attempts to use maybe the past tense might go wrong a lot. There might be only be one or two that go right. So it's like a little skill. In terms of pronunciation and intonation, you're, again, top bracket, some inconsistency. Where the marks start to become lower is where we see a lack of intonation, and that can often indicate that an answer's been memorised, completely memorised, and there might be a delay in understanding your answer. Spontaneity and fluency, we're looking at a good exchange. You show some spontaneity, so you can talk off the top of your head if you need to, but you also use pre-learned responses, so you can memorise some of your answers, but don't memorise all of them. You're allowed to hesitate. And again, you might not be able to respond to some questions, and that's where you'll get in that bracket. Moving down, what would limit you is the pre-learnt responses. So for instance, much of what is said, so there's a lot more in this bracket that's learnt than in this bracket. In terms of the higher mark scheme, like I said, bottom two, these are the same as foundation. So if we look at communication for the higher tier, the top marks, consistently develops responses. So you're looking at consistently going above and beyond the minimum. Narrates events coherently. So it's talking really, really in depth about an activity when asked to do so. You convey communication clearly at all times, so your verbs are on point. And you give and explain opinions convincingly. What we mean by that is, for instance, me gusta, I like studying languages since you can learn lots about other cultures. That is a much more convincing reason why you like studying languages rather than just saying they're interesting. So that's what it means by explaining opinions convincingly. Moving down, if we look at the range and accuracy of language, it's looking at a wide range of linguistic structures. So are you varying up, looking at things like synonyms, and looking at, rather than using me gusta all the time, using me encanta, me chifla, me flipa, me interesa, me fascina, okay? Using a range, as well as a range of vocabulary. So again, if you're saying, for instance, mis amigos, could you switch it up for mis primos? You're allowed, again, a few minor errors, so things like gender agreements, and you're allowed errors when you're using more complex structures. I'm going to comment on complexity in a minute. In terms of pronunciation and intonation, it's got to be consistently good all the way throughout for it to get for that top bracket. And spontaneity, I think the key thing of this is, I think a lot of people think that you have to speak like a native speaker to get in this top bracket for this section. You don't. You've got to have an air spontaneity, so you're talking off the top of your head. You know your way around your answers. You know what you want to say, but it's not memorised. Okay, that's the key thing. And you respond promptly and speak with some fluency, not necessarily that with a native speaker. So you don't have to be like a native. What I would suggest though is you use things such as pues. You use things like a ver. So, well, let's say as little fillers, okay? Those are important because they help buy you time so you can think. Having looked at the mock schemes, I think it's important that before we finish, we look at complexity and what it consists of. This is taken from the writing exam, but I think a lot of what is defined in the writing exam appendices is applicable for the speaking. So write a vocab. Again, they're mentioning using synonyms. So rather than just use me gusta, could you use prefiero? Could you use me encanta? Rather than using genial, could you use espléndido, emocionante, estupendo, maravilloso? So shaking them up rather than just using the bog standard basic ones. Use more sophisticated vocabulary. Could you use things such as, rather than no me gusta mi hermano, no me llevo bien con mi hermana? Or could you use
me peleo con?
And complex and longer sentences. Things that are pretty, when you think about them on the surface, are not too hard at all. Things such as using cuando, donde, porque without using an accent. To give you an example, there is a park where you can play basketball. And again, it's just nicer than just saying, hay un parque, puedes jugar al baloncesto. It's just a little bit more sophisticated. Using things such as that or who to introduce a relative clause. And the present subjunctive. Now, the present subjunctive is one of the more difficult concepts because it doesn't exist in English, but you can shoehorn it in. You could use, for instance, no creo que sea interesante. If you're giving an opinion on something. No me gusta el inglés, no creo que sea interesante. I don't think it's interesting. Just shoehorn it in like that, and just by putting it in as a set phrase, you'll get the credit for that sophistication. In terms of variety of structures, I think the big thing is this one, the use of the infinitive. I would strongly recommend you go for infinitive structures. Things such as puedo, I can, se puede. Se puede or se pueden. One can. Things such as debo, I must. Things such as suelo, I usually, or in the past, solía, I used to. The reason why I'm saying this is because they all count as sophisticated, but not just that, they actually take the pressure off you having to conjugate a verb in the moment. If you take, for instance, solía, what's easier, saying, era impaciente, or solía ser impaciente, for I used to be impatient. I would say that one's easier, personally. Using object pronouns, things such as me interesa, things such as lo encuentro, I find it. Connectives as well, a wide range of connectives, using things such as sino también, but using the more sophisticated ones, yo por una parte, por otra parte, por un lado, por otro lado. Adverbs, don't neglect your adverbs. Things such as primero, luego, más tarde. And when we come back to this concept of narration, if you're doing that, if you're using them, you are narrating by the nature of it. Your negatives, the more sophisticated ones, your nadie, no one, your tampoco. Comparatives, nice and straightforward as well. And your lo plus adjective as well. So for instance, lo bueno es que. But manipulating it, so you could even use lo bueno era que, the good thing was that. So some little things to think about for complexity. And when we're talking about narration and building up ideas and discourse length, this is a really, really useful frame that I use. So for instance, if we take a bog standard sentence such as
Juego al fútbol.
I play football, I can ask myself these questions and build my sentence length up. So I could say juego
Al fútbol en el parque.
So I've increased from 3 words to 6 words. I could say with him,
Juego al fútbol en el parque con mis amigas.
I've gone up to 9 words now. I could say when. And finally, I could also say why. So I could say, this is going to take me a while. There we go. Los lunes juego a fútbol en el parque con mis amigas en el parque. I've just remembered I've repeated that, so I'll get rid of that. Ya que nos encanta el fútbol. That's so much longer than just simply saying juego a fútbol. So, to finish, my tips. Don't memorise the whole thing. The reason I'm saying that is because it can cost you marks on the spontaneity and fluency. If you don't understand a question, ask for it to be repeated. You are allowed to use repair strategies, and I would advocate that, because if you start answering a question wrong, that's going to be taken into account in the communication mark. Say why for every opinion you give, and not just that, use things such as puedes, you can, or puedo, I can, to make your justifications more complex. Know your tenses and have some examples up your sleeve ready to go. Things such as like having solía ready to put down straight away. Things such as going straight to fui. Your infinitive sentences, remember those classes of sophistication. And the last little thing is you have to ask a question. Pre-plan it. You get to choose your chosen theme. So have your question memorised up your sleeve, ready to ask your teacher. And I hope that's been useful.